Hi, everybody. It's Lisa Marie here. Hi, my sweet lifers. Listen, today we're doing another wonderful Sweet Life in Christ with Father Andrew. And today we're talking about Matthew. And
Yes.
so I'm so excited about Matthew. Matthew's
Yes.
one of those disciples that is kind of, for me, seems a little aloof.
A little bit, yeah.
I don't know
Little,
why, but that's just sort of been
it,
my take on him. Is a little bit aloof, a little bit disrespected
yeah.
because of his profession,
Yep.
and the other disciples are kind of looking at themselves and scratching their heads and going, "Why did Jesus pick you?
Yeah.
Like,
Not
why are
only
you
the
a part of
disciples,
this?"
but also the people who were in the Jewish community who Jesus tried to preach to and minister to. They're like, well, you're
What's
bringing on
going
tax.
on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Matthew, obviously we know him as the author of the Gospel of Matthew. He was another close disciple of Jesus. He was there to witness the ascension. He was, he obviously followed Jesus throughout his ministry, but it was his calling that really ruffled some feathers. So Matthew was a tax collector. He was in his booth when he called. Now we may hear that and say, well, tax collectors, IRS,
Yeah.
but they're not as, they're not. They must be cast out. We understand. Okay, they have a job. They probably don't like doing it, but they got to.
They got to do a job.
We
yeah.
need those people there. In that time, they were seen as traitors. So they were seen as they're Jewish people who are taking money from Jewish people and handing it over to Rome. So that's like the biggest sin in the Jewish culture at that time. And here Jesus he went, not only he ate with tax collectors and sinners, he kept company with them, but here he called a tax collector as he was at his job doing this thing that everyone hated him for. He went to him and said, "Follow me." And what did Matthew do? Just like the other disciples we talked about last time, dropped it off and followed him. And yeah, it ruffled feathers. People were wondering, why in the world is he eating with tax collectors? Why is he hanging out with tax collectors? And why is he calling a tax collector to follow him? But that call led Matthew to write his gospel and give us another account of Jesus' ministry. But it also helped form, form other churches. And so Matthew, just a little background, his gospel, that's one of the gospels that we think was written to a Jewish community.
Right.
Luke was written to Gentiles. Mark was written to people who, we're going through persecutions. Just saw the temple fall, so they thought the world is falling around us, and we needed some hope.
Right.
And Matthew, on the other hand, he was in Jerusalem. He was one of the disciples. He stayed in Jerusalem the longest. He ministered to Jerusalem before going out in Judea, and his gospel was written in Hebrew, and later on translated to Greek, but it was written in Hebrew, and because of that, we think that in a lot of the images of Jesus in Matthew's gospel was portraying him as the like another Moses, he tying him to the Jewish faith,
Right.
and saying this is the fulfillment of all that law.
So he really was the glue in many ways for the Jews or the Jewish people in his attempt to try to explain to them that Jesus was one of them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. No. Whereas, Luke is trying to write to Gentiles as a Gentile and say, this is, this guy's for us too. Yeah, Matthew is trying to write to Jewish people in Jerusalem who have heard about Jesus, who were waiting for the Messiah to say, guys, this is the Messiah we have been waiting for. And so, each gospel has a different thing that they're doing.
Yeah.
Each writer had a different, agenda, a different group they're writing to. And Matthew's was that, like you said, the glue, trying to bring the Jewish people to the messianic tradition of Jesus. And that's kind of, that's what it all started out as someone who nobody thought would be called by Jesus a tax collector. And, every time I think about that, every time I examine that, it makes me realize, what if we, there are people in our church or our culture who we say that person doesn't belong and we cast them out, what are we missing? Or, if we say, well, I've done so many things, I've heard that so many times. I've done too much to be accepted by Jesus, or I've done stuff in my past to be accepted by Jesus, and that shows that no matter who you are or what you do, Jesus has a place for you in his kingdom.
Yeah, and it's interesting, as a Christian, I've never really felt that way. I've always understood solidly maybe because I was so much involved in the church, I was never given an opportunity to feel like there was anything that I could ever do that would not have been forgiven.
Yeah.
And no, obviously, I haven't lived a crazy life. I haven't lived a life of murdering people or doing different things that would be considered bad or whatever, or immoral. But it's not a heavy weight in my heart because I've not felt that way. But I could see where somebody who maybe has, it's oftentimes I've realized when I visit with people who are veterans and they've served in wars, and especially one that we'll actually be doing on the episode, one of my granddaddies who was in both the Korean and the Vietnam War. The heaviest weight he has on his heart is the men that he lost, but also the people that he killed.
Yeah.
And that's a lot to weigh on your heart, and because especially when we're taught not to kill, and then you're in a position where you are supposed to kill. Yeah. So I can see where that would play out in feeling like maybe you're not worthy enough, or you can't get to a point where you would be redeemed by God or whatever. But it would have to be something really heavy. Yeah. For me anyway, I mean, to understand that, because it's not a concept that God is so good.
Yeah, exactly.
And he forgives everything. And
we still have this idea of God, a lot of us, we're kind of, but there's still this idea that, when we mess up, God's this vengeful God who is casting down wrath and rage on us if we mess up. But that's not God is a loving God who sent his only son to die for us, and asked us or told us, lay your sins upon me and I will take them up. Yeah. And yes, we, like you said, the people, there are vets who just feel like that has that just weighs.
That's just my only experience in terms of like trying to find a common kind of a person in the community that we could maybe use as an example for the show, for the viewers watching, is like, what would that look like with the person who would honestly feel so heavy that they could not be a part of God's love and redemption. And that's really the only thing I could really think of, just in my own personal experiences with people in life.
And it just proves that, there's nothing God won't forgive if, we turn our lives to him.
Absolutely.
That's the big cat. If we don't turn our lives, he can't, there's not going to, we can't get that. We have to turn to him. But when we do, no matter what we did in the past, God forgives. But that could also be flipped to those of us who are inside who know that. Because, again, we hear, I've heard of, and not personally, but people say, well, why do we want so-and-so in the church? They've done this, and this in their past. I know them when they're a teenager. I know them, what they've done. And, that's not the type of person we want,
That's
leading
not
our
our
church.
place to judge.
Exactly. And that's what people were saying about Matthew. Oh, well, we don't want a tax collector. We can't have a tax collector with this teacher. And I just keep thinking, if that was the mindset, if they would have said, okay, sorry, Matthew, you're on the fringe, we wouldn't have got this beautiful gospel that he wrote. So, it's always, like you said, that's not up to us. We are called to welcome back. We're called to love everybody, no matter what. And sometimes that tells us to love people who've done some pretty bad things.
But it goes back to everything that we've talked about, and the whole living the sweet life, and the whole concept of being a Christian altogether. We are to love one another.
Yes.
That's part of our 7 tenements of discipleship, period. We're supposed to love each other, and we're supposed to give each other passing of the peace and forgive each other. And that's the bottom line of all of it. And so I'm hoping, I'm assuming, because obviously you're the scholar and I'm not the scholar, but I'm hoping that even though James and John and maybe Andrew and Peter, a couple of people in that group, that close-knit group, were not too thrilled at the beginning of having him be a part of the pack.
Maybe,
that at the end of the day, they all came together and realized that he was a cool dude. And he was supposed to be there, and he was just as worthy as everybody else that Jesus selected.
Exactly. Matthew wasn't the only one. As we'll probably talk about later when we get to Paul. Paul is one of the most important Christian figures who helped put the church where it is, along with Peter. He's another one who did some terrible things to Christians, and they still welcomed him in, and they still accept him, even though it was kind of tough at first. They still did, and but Jesus called him. Jesus lifted him up just like he did Matthew, and so they, they may say, well, why Jesus? But they didn't say no, Jesus.
Yeah. So from the perspective of us, like really digging deep into what the disciples, who they were, what they did, where they are in terms of landing in our own personal space to kind of reflect on similarities to us today. Matthew really represents the person who you think might not need to be there.
Maybe.
Matthew's
maybe.
the guy, the dude that you see that's the dude over in the corner that you're like, why are you at church today?
Exactly, yeah.
That's the Matthew. That's the one. And when you feel like, oh, you're maybe a little bit higher than someone else because you've been in the church your whole life, or you have gone and done all these things in the community, and you see someone over in the corner who may not be having contributed as much as what you've contributed, but you have that feeling in your heart of like, well, you don't really need to be here.
Yeah.
That's the feeling we need to go refer to as, this is the Matthew feeling.
Yeah.
This is the Matthew feeling, and that's not the case.
No.
We're all equal in the eyes of God.
Yeah, exactly. We're all children of God, but God also brought that person to this place for a specific purpose.
Yeah.
And this person has gifts just like we do. And sometimes it takes, and we had heard stories about people being pushed away by the church because they were perceived like, what do they have to offer? What do they,
Or, the Zeus service starts at 8 or whatever it was that church said to me with the children. And I remember in another episode, we were talking, and I was like, are you out of your mind? I'm bringing children to church.
Exactly.
And you do not need to be representing church.
Exactly.
And then I thought, well, maybe you do need to be representing church, but maybe someone needs to teach you a lesson about what you're supposed to be representing.
Because that's again, a good reminder. We all represent God, and there's two ways we can represent Him: in a positive light or a negative light. And sometimes when we push people away, who we think, well, they have negative traits or they have a negative thing, like some churches unfortunately view having children negative for some reason. But, when we push them away, we're pushing away from Jesus.
I mean, like, that's the next generation.
Yeah.
We're supposed to, if anything,
Exactly.
I can only, in my mind, I picture if I were alive and Jesus was alive, I see him as sitting in the middle of a room with all the babies crawling all over him and just screaming.
He after all, he said that.
All of those things. And he would have been like just in absolute, not to use the word heaven, but use the word heaven. That is the most beautiful thing. Children are the most beautiful thing. And it's not a place to be all quiet and reverent and solemn and sad. It's a place to rejoice in him and his beautiful love.
Mark, that in Mark's gospel, we hear that where the children are trying to get up to Jesus, and the disciples like, send them away, Jesus. And he said, no. He was indignant. No, you let them come to me.
Yeah.
And that's another, we miss the gifts that sometimes we as a church can miss gifts that people offer, including families with children who do offer us a future. And it's funny, every church says we want children and families with children, but how are we truly bringing them in?
Exactly.
And so, and it all goes back to this idea that we know what the church needs, but we don't. God knows and we just need to trust God. When He sends somebody our way, when He sends a family our way, when He sends an individual who's aloof or we don't know much about, or we do know their past, like I've seen what that person's done this and this. God sent them to us for a purpose.
That's the thing too, Father. I honestly believe, and this is part of the whole, like those that have been with me for years and know me and have read the writing and all the other things, is that there is not one human being that is in our lives that is not there for a specific reason.
Exactly.
And if you stop all of the bullshit, okay? I'm going to say that. I'm going to go there on this channel. And just pay attention to that.
Yeah.
Just like you go outside and you like walk around and you ignore the butterflies, you ignore the bumblebees, you ignore the sunset. Stop ignoring things.
Yeah.
And pay attention in a way that every single moment of your life, there's a reason and there's a purpose. Yeah. And when you do that, the whole world opens up and you realize that person that may not look like somebody to you that you want to be friends with, you're beside them because God has placed them there. There's something you're supposed to do or they're supposed to do. You've got to figure that out while you're here. But that didn't just happen. It happened for a reason.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's really interesting when you really think about that way. Because I remember there was a little story. There was an old lady in our town in North Carolina, and she was not mentally well. Mm-hmm. And one morning on Sunday, she came strolling in the church, plopped down on like the second or the third pew. And in the Baptist church, each family has their own spot that they sit every Sunday. And those are not the spots that you get to, that's just not what you do. So she plopped down in the middle of somebody else's spot. and disturbed the congregation.
Yeah.
And I remember the deacons or someone got up and literally escorted her out of the church. And I remember that as a child and not feeling like that was what we were supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
But I mean, I understood. They didn't know that, she was going to start speaking in tongues, or if she was drunk or whatever. I get it, safety, maybe whatever. But back in North Carolina, 40 years ago, as a 10-year-old, it struck me as strange, because church is supposed to always be open, and church is supposed to always be welcoming, and you're supposed to be able to go there no matter what's going on. It's kind of like that Home Alone movie, where he goes and the bells are doing it, and he's scared, he's home alone, and he's there, and he knows it's a safe haven for him to be at. If there's not any place else on earth besides our homes, our churches need to be that way. So,
can I share one last story just to kind of paint that picture, kind of piggyback on? So at the church I served at before I came to St. Catherine's up in Marshall, Texas, we had a gentleman who started coming, because we did a Thursday night feeding ministry, and he started coming to that. But then he decided he wanted to start coming to our church and come to services. And he didn't bathe all the time. He was disheveled. He was an African American man, and he sometimes had homes, sometimes he slept on the streets. But he wanted to come to church.
Right.
There's a little bit of some people said, okay, well, should we should we talk to him? Maybe have him sit somewhere else. But then eventually they said, no, we're going to start treating him like part of our community, because there's something there to offer. And it took about 6 years of him coming, and in 2019, before the pandemic, the bishop was visiting, and he was sitting in the congregation waiting for the service, and the bishop was going over baptism, and he called me over. He said, Father Andrew. I said, yes. He said, I haven't been baptized. I said, oh, really? He's like, I'd like to be baptized today. And I told the bishop, hey, bishop, he hasn't been baptized. And, we didn't know for sure if he had it, because he also had some other mental.
Yeah.
So, but the fact that he was welcomed in this church and treated as one of his own led to him accepting Jesus Christ and becoming a baptized Christian. And he was baptized on the spot. And when we called Larry to get up, and he stood up, everybody oh, we didn't know he wasn't. And there's some tears going down, because this was one of ours. And we could have done two things. We could have said, no, you need to go somewhere else. You stink, or you didn't comb your hair, or whatever.
Right.
But instead we realized this is a child of God that has something to offer. And he gave us something, and we gave him something. And that's what the church is called to do. Welcome people into their midst who God sent to them. God sent them for a reason. God sent Matthew, or called Matthew for a reason.
Yeah.
And the church, luckily, listened to that. And so it's just a reminder, we just trust God.
Exactly. Always.
Yep.
Always.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank you
Thank
again
you.
for an absolutely fantastic Sweet Life in Christ. And listen, guys, if you found any value in this, do us a favor. Don't forget to like and share, ring the bell. You can get a hold of Father and I both. We've got all the information on how to get a hold of us in the episode notes. And we're going to continue our journey through the disciples, and we're going to then move into the women in the Bible.
Yes.
And then we're going to do some Q&A at some point and see if there's anything that we can answer for people, because it's getting a lot of information out there to the world, but it's getting a lot of questions too.
Yeah.
I get a lot of Facebook and a lot of Instagram questions about, oh my gosh, I'm seeing your Sweet Life in Christ. It's so wonderful.
Awesome.
And so this is going to be wonderful. So we'll see you soon, guys.
Bye.
Take care.